de esta actividad en el sitio web del Instituto Salvadoreño del Seguro Social. Ahí las pueden ver, ahí pueden bajar las diferentes fotos, descargarlas y hacer sus propias publicaciones en las diferentes instituciones a las que ustedes pertenecen. Queremos pedirles, por favor, a las delegaciones, miembros de las delegaciones que se encuentran todavía en la antesala del salón, incorporarnos para dar inicio a esta sesión de la tarde. Dos, tres. Ok, gracias. Uno, dos, tres. Ok, ahí estamos. ¿Listo?
¿Empezamos?
Muy buenas tardes para todas las delegaciones, señoras y señores, que se encuentran con nosotros. Vamos a dar inicio a esta sesión. El tema que se tratará en esta sesión es la tendencia en la adecuación de los beneficios en los sistemas de pensiones. Nuestro panelista será Simon Brimblecombe, de la Asociación Internacional de Seguridad Social, AISS, y nuestro moderador será Jorge D'Angelo de Amaute y presidente de la Comisión Americana del Adulto Mayor. Para dar inicio a esta ponencia con nuestros panelistas, tendré el placer de leer parte del currículum profesional de Jorge D'Angelo. Es presidente de la Comisión Americana del Adulto Mayor desde su creación en 1999. También es presidente honorario de AMAUTE desde 1999. También es secretario de Coordinación de Organización de la Unión Personal Civil de la Nación, UPCN, el principal sindicato de los trabajadores del Estado de Argentina desde 1997. Trabaja en la Seguridad Social desde 1979 en el Instituto Nacional de Servicio Social para Jubilados y Pensionados de la República de Argentina. Dejaré con ustedes a Jorge D'Angelo, quien hará la presentación de nuestro panelista Simon Brimblecombe.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos y a todas. Gracias por venir. Sé que es duro después del almuerzo, siempre es la ponencia que cuesta más para empezar, por eso demoramos un poco el comienzo para dar la posibilidad de que lleguen todos. Voy a presentar a Simon Brimblecombe, que es coordinador del proyecto de análisis de políticas e investigación de la Asociación Internacional de la Seguridad Social con sede en Ginebra, Suiza. Es el responsable de proyectos de la ISSS en busca de adecuación de las prestaciones de seguridad social y el impacto de las tendencias futuras en la previsión de la seguridad social. También trabaja en proyectos de la ISSS para ampliar la cobertura y está muy involucrado en la redacción de las publicaciones de la ISSS que cubren las tendencias en la prestación de la seguridad social. Es un calificado actuario y economista y cuenta con más de 15 años de experiencia trabajando en temas de reforma de la seguridad social. Ha trabajado en proyectos de reforma de la seguridad social en más de 20 países, entre ellos Egipto, Malasia, Kazajstán, Polonia, Rusia y Omán. Sin más preámbulos, gracias Simon por tu presencia aquí, le cedo la palabra. Previamente quería aclarar un poco las reglas de la parte de las preguntas de este panel. Hemos resuelto por una cuestión de economía de tiempos y dado que hemos empezado más tarde, que las preguntas las puedan hacer por escrito y se arrimen acá a la mesa. Va a haber para ello dos personas que van a estar con unos papelitos y lapiceras para que ustedes puedan arrimarnos las preguntas y Simon con mucho gusto las va a contestar. Muchas gracias. Ahora sí.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias. No voy a hablar en castellano, primero porque hablo español con un acento muy fuerte y británico, y segundo porque he olvidado casi todo mi castellano que aprendí hace 15 años, entonces voy a cambiar, voy a hablar en inglés. Voilà. Firstly, I'd like to thank the CISS and for the introduction, and I'd also like to thank our hosts here in El Salvador for what is a great venue. I look forward to discovering a little bit of this country that I don't know as well, and it's a great opportunity for me and for ISSS to be here today to talk to you about trends in adequacy. For those of you who don't know the ISSS, I hope most of you will know of us. Our members are social security institutions. We have over 350 members in over 150 countries. I think we're not quite as many countries as FIFA or the Olympic Organization, but we're not far away. We're here to assist our members putting into place social security, dynamic social security that responds to the needs of populations. Thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, I'm responsible for policy analysis and research, and I hope to share with you today some of the key trends in adequacy and also some of the work of ISSS in terms of supporting measures for adequacy. Let's see if my slideshow works. Voilà. So when Gabrielle asked me to do a presentation on adequacy, one of the tricks is sometimes to see how would you present with just one slide. So I drew up this table and I thought, well, what do people think of adequacy of social security benefits? And maybe the public perception is something like, something like this. And it was very interesting that the presentation this morning on immigration, because I think immigration has a lot of parallels with social security. There's a big difference between perception and reality. And one of the key roles of social security is to move perception of the public to what we do, to what is the reality, because we're often doing better than what the public thinks. And just an example for the immigration this morning, the slide that went up, it showed 10% of the population in the UK are immigrants. And they had a survey and they asked the population, what do you think the number of immigrants are in the UK? And the figure came out was 25%. So people think it's much higher than reality. Then they asked a question, they said, what do you think is the level of fraud in social security and social protection? What is the percentage of benefits paid out that are claimed fraudulently? And the answer that came out was 25%, and the reality is less than 1%. So it really shows there's a big difference between reality and what people think in social security. So I came up with this slide, and this is really what the reality of what many people think over time. There's this idea in the public debate that I'm going to get less than my parents are getting, my grandparents are getting, and over time this is a bit inevitable, and this is why I'm angry about the situation. And then you say, well, what about all the reforms, the pension reforms? At ISSS, we have a database of pension reforms. Isn't that going to improve the situation? And they say what the reforms is going to do is something like this. Yeah, it's going to make a big difference, and then after all these reforms, we're going to end up about here. So my talk today is really to show, hopefully, what the reality of the situation is like, that this isn't really what's happening, but the different way of approaching adequacy, what adequacy is, and the measures taken to ensure that this slide here is not actually the reality of the situation, and at the same time isn't as perceived. Okay, so my presentation this afternoon, I nearly said this morning there, sorry about that, it's about 11 o'clock in Geneva, so I'm not sure what time zone I'm on at the moment, but my 4 messages, I think, in this presentation this afternoon, and I think these are quite important, and if there's only 4 things you take away, I'd like you to take away these things. Firstly, we often hear that you can improve the sustainability of the system by reducing benefit levels, the adequacy, and you often hear this. And really the reality is something completely different, and the inverse. by providing adequate benefits that are valued by the population, you're supporting sustainable social security, because social security will only be supported by the public and politicians if it's providing benefits that are adequate for the population. So providing adequate benefits is improving sustainability. Before we can improve adequacy, though, we need to define it. We need to define it and we need to measure it. And the idea of my presentation and the ISSS project on adequacy is actually we know that adequacy is more than just providing a certain replacement ratio or targeting a certain replacement ratio, but actually that's often what the debate comes down to, simply looking at the different replacement ratios in different countries, maybe on different scenarios. So once we can define and measure adequacy on this multivariable measure, we can then move to a number of measures to put in place to actually improve adequacy and to make sure that first slide you saw is not actually the reality. Okay. I made the mistake of having a lot of animations on my slides, so I'm really going to be wearing this thing out, I think. So can we define an adequate benefit? Well, adequate benefit is something that we think we know what it is, but it's actually quite difficult to define, I think. But I think there are two elements of adequacy. I think the first one is at the individual and family level. It's a benefit that meets the needs of the individual and his or her family members. And the second one, which is perhaps less discussed, but equally important, is a benefit that meets the wider needs of society. And sometimes those two aims can be in contradiction, which is something I'll talk about a bit later on. We also think we know why adequacy is important, but I think it's worthwhile just spelling that out again. Because one thing about a lot of the studies on adequacy and all these replacement ratios and calculations is that we sometimes forget the main aim of social security, which was discussed this morning. That is to meet the needs of the population. But there are other reasons as well. Not only is social security meeting its needs and therefore fulfilling its objectives, but by providing adequate benefits, then public confidence in social security increases. And that has two important measures. Firstly, it provides an important incentive effect. So not only incentive for those currently in the system to perhaps stay in the system, but more importantly, those in the informal sector or those in systems with voluntary contributions, it incentivizes them to contribute to be part of the system. Because ultimately, if you're providing a benefit which is only slightly above what a minimum benefit is, how can you expect people to pay contributions for 20, 30 or 40 years? And I'd recommend at ISSS we have a social security review. It's a journal, research journal. And last year we had an excellent paper from Professor Mesalago, who talked exactly about this incentive effect in Latin America and the Caribbean, and made the point of the importance of the big difference between providing the minimum benefit and providing an adequate benefit. It has to have quite a big difference between the two to have this incentive effect. And it was interesting to see on the program that the two of the research papers in the prize are talking about the role of social security in formalizing the informal sector. Because that's one thing we've noticed in our member countries, this idea that economic growth will formalize the informal sector on its own has not turned out to be true. So social security can play a role. It's also important social security can play other roles, adequate benefits to support other benefit measures. Social security is a very efficient way of getting money into the economy as well, has very low relative administration costs. So again, providing additional money, dollar, pesos, euros through social security is a very efficient way and provides a feedback effect, economic feedback, leverage effects. So there's lots of reasons why we should provide adequate benefits. And adequacy, I'm not going to step on the toes of presentations coming later on sustainability, but it's important to note, I think, that sustainability is not just financial, it's political and public support. And as I said at the start, this idea that lower benefits means more sustainable is not actually true. Again, so adequate benefits ultimately is a more sustainable social security system. Okay, so hopefully a lot of this, no doubt, you already know or appreciate, but the rest of my presentation is on defining, measuring, and improving adequacy. What is an adequate benefit? How can we define and we can measure it? So we often see this. We often see this phrase that 60% of my last salary is an adequate benefit. We have a lot of systems with benefit formula based on 60%, 65, maybe 70%. However, it's, as we know, more complicated than that. What about, and these are legitimate questions, if I earn half average earnings, then 60% isn't enough. Is 60% guaranteed, particularly a question now with a move towards defined contributions, notional defined contribution systems? Okay, when is it paid? What age is it paid? Is it paid when I want it to be paid? That surely is a measure of adequacy. You can have a 60% final salary payable at aged 80, but that's not an adequate benefit in any sense of the term. Do I have some sort of stability? Do I get the same every year? More increasing question now is, can I continue working? Can I continue working full-time or part-time? What happens to my pension? Is it worth continuing working? So these are many countries faced with financial constraints are saying to workers, well, you have to continue working without putting in place the pension system that goes with it. Because after 65 or 70, only a minority of people may want to carry on working at 100%, but there's a sizable minority who would like to carry on part-time. Is it worth saving? Do I know I'm going to get this? A very important question for systems, multi-pillar systems. And how easy is it to get this benefit? Is it means tested? Do I have to fill in forms? What's the eligibility requirements? So we know 60% on its own is not enough, and we need to address these questions. So how do we address these questions? We address these by looking at these multiple aims, coming back to the multiple aims. So for the individuals, it's not just the benefit level that's important. For society, we need to support certain aims. So we don't want, if we have a shortage of skilled workers, we talked about immigration before. In a lot of countries and some sectors, we have a lack of skilled workers, hence increase in immigration levels. So if we don't have a system that keeps trained technical people with lots of experience in work, then we can say the system's not adequate. Okay, there's increasing, I think the ISSS project isn't the only one. There's a move away from this analysis of just using a financial measure as a measure of adequacy. And the idea is a higher benefit is not necessarily more adequate. You need to consider the other objectives and the other aims of a retirement benefit system. So often when I show this slide and I say a higher benefit isn't necessarily a more adequate benefit, sometimes get strange looks and saying, well, you're undermining Social Security. Not at all. This is a question of having a system that encourages the behaviours you want to get the public support that allows people to work for the length of time they want, at the same time as protecting employees and meeting the needs of the population. Not an easy equilibrium to get. Okay, so the ISSS project looks at this multivariable measure of adequacy. I think it's important that we consider this wider view of adequacy. It's also important because a lot of this is reflecting your policy and your aims and objectives and what you need to do on a daily basis. But it's not always appreciated, I think, and it's not always easy to measure. So this famous phrase, what can be measured can be managed, and this is particularly true, I think, of assessing whether benefits are adequate. Also, as I said before, what's the point in providing very generous early retirement benefits if these people not only want to work, but society, the economy needs these people? So this multivariable measure of adequacy moves to this a more efficient use of resources. It means that Social Security is considering the big picture. And it's a message that Social Security isn't just about paying benefits out, and it's very static, it's a very reactive and proactive as well. And also I think it's important, the wider debate on what Social Security does. At the ISSS we have a variety of initiatives. One of them is proactive and preventative measures, which talk often about workplace safety, but it's also about pension and health and disability, and it means that we broaden the debate on what Social Security is doing. Okay, so this broader measure of adequacy should consider these seven items. Firstly, we need to consider what individuals are getting from elsewhere, what are the other benefits and services providing. We need to consider how stable, secure these benefits are, how likely I am to get them, and that the level stays the same. Is the system sustainable? I may be getting it today, but will my children get it the same thing in 20, 25 years' time? Moving a little bit ahead, you just give thanks. Now the inequality, a very important issue. We talked about that a little bit this morning. Supporting labour market aims, how easy it is to get the benefits themselves, and of course the benefit levels do form part of this measure. Okay, so we can you put the next slide on, please. This figure in the blue box comes from the IADB, which was a very surprising statement that we had in our research seminar in, it's just in Spanish, I'm afraid, up there. It's just our research seminar in Oslo. We had a presentation from the IADB, and this statistic that in Brazil, a 65-year-old woman in rural Brazil has an income 78% higher than a 55-year-old woman. And for a man, the figure is 40%. I mean, these are quite dramatic figures. And this means that something is wrong somewhere because there's not the right transition. Either one benefit's too high or one benefit's too low. So if we don't have a benefit from Social Security that takes into account the other benefits, the other services provided, then again, we're not doing the right things. We're not providing adequate benefits. But this is obviously easier said than done. I put on the right-hand side of that chart. If you can read that at the back, your eyesight is better than mine. It's really just to give you an idea of how complex this issue is. In that, as far as possible, we need to take into account benefits from other sources. So Pillar 0 to Pillar 4 on the World Bank type terminology. But this can be things from tax finance, social protection, up to individual family support and passing through Social Security, second pillar, third pillar. So how we do that is something that the Adequacy Project is looking at. This is a question of coordination with other stakeholders, having information, having correct policies, having the right incentives, so it's incentivizing for people to be part of Social Security, that they're incentivized or able to leave the workforce. It's incentivizing also has the right incentives for employers as well. Okay, next slide, please. The second element is what I called security of adequacy. And I think this is a very important point and one, again, which is often overlooked. As you know, the OECD do a number of excellent publications, Pensions at a Glance, Pensions Outlook, and we work very closely with the OECD as we do with the ILO, World Bank and other international organizations. And their figures they have a range of different figures on replacement ratios, which are a good indication of one indication of adequacy. But I think what's very important is that with a move from defined benefit provision to defined contribution provision, there's a move away from a security of benefit. It's much harder for people to know what sort of benefit they're going to get. And that would be okay if we're talking about 20 or 30 or even 40-year-olds. It would be okay because they can then adapt their behavior, their insurance products available, they can do something about it. But we're actually talking about pensioners or those close to retirement. And if you find out that your benefit is not what you expect, when you get close to retirement, there's very little you can do about it. And I just want to give one example from my home country, the UK. with a very high level of second pillar provision and a quite low social security. Someone with the same contribution record to a defined contribution plan, retiring in 2010 and 2000. The person retired in 2010 had a 30% lower pension with exactly the same salary, exactly the same contributions going in because of investment returns, because of annuity rates and so on. So how can you have a system that in 10 years and often less loses 30%? And it's a very, very difficult thing for individuals to adapt to. And often, in most countries, there is a legal age of retirement, so it's not that they can then carry on working for another 3 or 4 years. Often they don't have the choice. So this part of adequacy, I think, is a very important one. As I said, it's becoming more of an issue now because of the number of reforms to Social Security, an increase in the move to defined contribution and notional defined contribution, change to other pillars as well. So we see a lot of regulatory change. One of the issues as well with this first slide I showed you with the red arrow going round and round is that people feel that the rules are changing all the time. They don't feel secure, and this is not necessarily Social Security, but it's often second and third pillar provision. So this idea that I don't really know what I'm going to get, it's not very secure, it's becoming an issue, and also reduction in things like pension increases, change in rules, and so on. Now, the implications for Social Security are quite important here. For one side, this is a policy issue. We need to have policy consistency over the long term. Very difficult to do when governments change every 5 years. Giving away pensions is a very nice thing to do because you get the credit and the government in 20 years' time has to pick up the bill. So it's not always easy, and it's silly to be naive, but we need to support policy consistency. But on the administrative side, I think there is a way as well of improving this is to provide as much information as possible, not only on benefit projections, but also the risks involved, the different outcomes that can actually come. Okay, next slide, please. It's also very important, this issue of sustainability. I prefer also to put in the term intergenerational equity because I think it's not only sustainable, each country has a view on what they think is the right level to pay to support their pension system. Whether it's sustainable, you can have golden rules in terms of how much GDP can be spent on pensions, but basically this is a society decision. So it's more important to say, is the current financing and benefit level system actually going to be there in 20 and 30 or 40 years' time? Because otherwise you can legitimately claim that you're sort of cheating future generations. And if you look at the OECD reports, the 36 countries, which were the 28 OECD countries plus Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, only 4 of them had a lower public spending amount in 2050 compared to 2010, and 14 of them, so about 40%, as a percentage of GDP, see a 50% increase in the GDP, a level of GDP spent on pensions. Now that's possible, that's sustainable, but is that fair? Is that intergenerational equity? That's certainly an open question. Next slide, please. One of the things which I presented quite recently at a conference in Stockholm as part of our project is try and look at this by looking at figures of these 8 countries here. And just to briefly explain, these are 8 countries with 3 replacement ratios. Now the one in the middle, the current replacement rates, are people retiring today. So what they get as a percentage of their last salary, the gross current replacement rates. The column on the left, the backward looking, are people who retired 10 years ago. So how much they're getting as a pension as a proportion of those earning age between 55 and 64. And the one on the right side is what people are going to get who are entering the workforce now. So if you look at the middle column compared to the right column, and just to give you an example, in France, these figures would show that someone retiring now, earning, let's say, 10,000 euros, would have a replacement ratio of 64%, but someone entering the workforce now would only have 49%. So you can see that in almost all these countries, the replacement rate, apart from the Netherlands, actually decreases over time. Now, these are from different sources, so there are some consistency issues, but there's quite a consistency there in the trends over time, and quite some interesting things to pick out. Because this picks out not only the difference between people retiring now and those entering the system now who retire in 40 years' time, but also those who retired 10 years ago, who we need to keep our promise to as well. So there's three generations here: the current retirees, those who've retired in the past, and future retirees. Measure of adequacy should be respecting all these three generations. Next slide, please. Another important thing, and I'm pleased we touched on this morning, was the question of inequality. Inequality, and it was very interesting hearing the first two presentations this morning about Social Security in El Salvador. And in a number of countries, you could argue that Social Security has possibly exacerbated inequalities, because Social Security in many countries has been set up on the basis of a formal employer-employee relationship. So those in the informal sector, or migrant workers or domestic workers, have not had an access to Social Security. So benefits were being provided to those who arguably needed it the least. And so this question of inequality and adequacy is very important for us. And obviously there are different types of inequality. There's rural or urban, there's wealth, there's health, and obviously gender. And the one I featured here was gender, which again was discussed in length in the interesting session we had before lunch. If we look at the OECD pensions at a glance figures of the 42 countries, 12 have lower replacement ratios for women than for men, which is already something that is, pretty worrying, that 12 of 42 have a lower replacement ratio for women. I should add that 0 have a lower replacement ratio for men. But of course, the real picture, the problem with these statistics, there's a famous saying about statistics: 98% of statistics are false. And this really depends on the assumptions, because for the other 30 countries which don't look too bad, when in fact it's actually pretty bad, because the assumptions are that we have the same career lengths, we have the same salary levels, we have the same access to benefits. In reality, career length for women are shorter, salary levels still are lower. For equivalent jobs, it's still the case. Salary increases are lower. Now, defined benefit final salary systems tend to favour those with a higher salary increase over time. So we have a distribution from those with a slower salary increase to those with a higher salary increase. So again, distribution from men to women in many countries. Often systems also discriminate against part-time work, which again is often a higher proportion of women in part-time work than men. So this is a very important thing, and this is one of our key, we work on trienniums at ISSS, and our next triennium starts next year, and one of our key projects is in inequality. So what can Social Security do? There are a number of measures. One aspect which was mentioned this morning is access to benefits, a move in a number of countries to individual entitlements. So rather than having a benefit and a spouse's benefit, we have an individual entitlement with credit for time spent raising children or time out of the workforce. And we can change parameters as well. We had an interesting presentation from our Polish member at the actuarial conference last year. And in Poland, the replacement ratios are much lower for women than for men. And one of the reasons is because women retire at age 60 and men at age 65. And Poland has a system with a big emphasis on defined contribution and notional defined contribution. And one of the proposed, this is, I might add, a woman presenting, was to raise the retirement age from 60 to 65 for women. Now this is obviously a key issue in a lot of countries. In Europe, most countries have equalised retirement age, but this is certainly a debate, and measures are needed to accompany this change if that actually happens. Another thing is to work with other stakeholders to ensure there is access to social security benefits, formalising the labour market and so on. Next slide, please. Related to the labour market, as I mentioned before, one of the parameters should be if the system supports the labour market. And I've just put a table up here again from Europe showing that it's quite a strong correlation between employment rates, effective labour market exit ages and retirement age. So in countries such as France, Italy, Poland, you have a lower retirement age, and in Netherlands, Germany, you have a higher retirement age. Now that's not to say there's a direct combination, but that's to say that an adequate benefit system should ensure that the system encourages the employment market objectives. And a little bit of advertising here. I'm responsible for the Megatrends project, which looks at labour market trends, and the trends identified in Latin America here on the left-hand side. These are the trends that need to be taken into account. I'd recommend the report is available. I'd recommend it because it gives a good summary of some of the key factors that Social Security should take into account when it's looking at labour market changes. Okay, next slide, please. The final element is a very stupid comment, obvious comment, I suppose. If people aren't covered, they won't have an adequate benefit. So one element of adequacy should be, are people actually getting it? So again, a typical replacement rate figures for this hypothetical person who contributes a certain number of years. But there's actually quite a big difference between legal and effective coverage. And the ILO actually estimated that throughout the world, legal coverage was 40%. That is, 40% of the working age population were legally covered, but only 25% were effectively covered. So it shows there is a big gap even when employees are covered legally between whether they're actually contributing and covered accruing benefits. And one of the key things which we've already talked about quite a lot is covering these hard to cover groups, difficult to cover groups, such as the self-employed, such as migrant workers. Again, this is another ISSS project on specific measures to put in place to cover these hard to cover groups. And finally, if they are legally covered, do we make it easy for them to actually claim benefits? So coverage is essential part of adequacy. We produce our regional development and trends report, and one of the things highlighted in the Americas report was the Social Security education, which starts at school levels. And we had a lot of examples from many countries in Latin America, where the idea of Social Security, what it is, why is it there, the idea of solidarity starts at school age. And I think this is really, really important, because once you get it starting early, then it becomes ingrained in a population, and it's more likely to have public support and strength. Okay, next slide, please. This was I've taken this again from the IADB, who presented at our conference in Oslo. And that Social Security can improve coverage, can improve adequacy, but other measures are required as well. And I think this is quite a nice graph which shows that the reality is still that the more you earn, the more likely you are to be covered by Social Security. At the same time, there's a big difference on the first one here between the brown and the grey, between those who are independent, working for themselves, and those who are salaried employees. And again, it's correlated to company size as well. Now, Social Security can do a lot here to simplify the procedures for small companies, for independents. There's a lot of really good examples that we have at ISSS. What methods can you put in place to encourage small enterprises independent? And we actually have a manual here on covering those who are self-employed and independent. Okay, next slide, please. So as an actuary, I didn't want to do a project without having a very complicated Excel spreadsheet and a nice graph. So I hadn't done a spider graph for a while, so I thought, why not? And the idea here is I modelled this, well, I put high income, this is actually for the UK, I modelled it for the UK, and trying to, based on the ISSS, our model, which we're developing together with our members, we've got a few pilot countries and institutions who are working with us, to measure the different elements of adequacy. So it's for me, it's not too complex model, but there are some elements of it. And for each of these elements on here, such as exiting labour market appropriate age, we try and estimate how to measure that. So we estimate the average age people leave the labour market, employment rates for elderly workers. For administrative capacity, so how easy it is for people to get benefits, we measure that on response times, or how many documents you need to provide. Each of these 7 has a number 4 or 5 different measures. Now the idea is not to come up with the right answer. The idea is to provoke the debate and say, well, actually, can I measure this? As I mentioned before, if I can measure it, I can manage it, and start to think about adequacy in a wider sense of the term. So security of adequacy, for example, is have pension increases kept up with inflation? Is it guaranteed what I get? Are there going to be adjustments that I don't know about? A lot of different elements. Okay, next slide, please. So this multivariable measure of adequacy has a number of implications. Firstly, for the policymakers, there's encouragement them to move away from the focus just on benefit levels, to think about how we can do things in different ways. Coordination and integration with other policies and other stakeholders, the role of employers, I think is very important, and a broader view of sustainability to try and encourage them to not cut benefits because it's not creating a sustainable system. For administrations, a number of implications is having up-to-date information, working with other stakeholders, improving claims processes, simplifying the documents required, ensuring there's good communication so people can plan their retirement, for example, annual benefit statements, and ensuring that this communication is tailored to the different groups you want to cover. Okay, next slide, please. So there are a number of examples that I won't go through all of these because I'm a bit limited on running out of time here, but a number of countries, this isn't a new concept, and individual members are doing these things already, looking at how to assess adequacy on this wider issue and how can you improve benefit adequacy. And just to give you maybe a couple of examples, Switzerland is looking at using contribution at an earlier age, using some of VAT revenue to improve adequacy levels. Malaysia has improved a lot the quality of their information they're providing with their Provident fund system. South Africa has invested a lot in mobile offices, so they actually go to meet where people are, because if you are working in a rural area, you might not have the time or the means to actually go to the central office. Russia has made a number of interesting measures to improve adequacy, improving the indexation rules, facilitating additional contributions, and other measures to encourage staying in work longer. So there are a lot of good examples there. A lot of them you can find on the ISSS website, but it shows, and this is something we want to highlight as well with the model, that institutions are already following this multivariable measure of adequacy. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to finish just with a couple of slides on the issue of defined contribution and provident funds. Now, this is, as I mentioned before, one aspect of adequacy on this multivariable model is the security of adequacy, how secure are benefits. And under a defined contribution or provident fund system, there are a number of ways to improve adequacy levels, not only on the benefits provided, but also on the security of adequacy. So I've put some of them up here. What's interesting is, I think anyway, is the payout of benefits side, the one in the red there. I didn't actually specifically choose red for a reason, just choose another color, but it's actually it's almost a red for danger, that one, because this is the area where people are suffering. And one of my colleagues on the table at lunch today mentioned the case of you arrive at retirement with 200,000. You think this is a big benefit, and 200,000, depending where you are, but will probably buy you a benefit of, say you have $200,000 in your account, maybe $1,000 a month. So 200,000 seems a lot of money, and when you actually convert it to a payment, you don't get a great deal. And this is one hidden aspect of this loose monetary policy we've seen in the last few years. If you actually calculate the loss for pensioners, this has been a big transfer of money from pensioners to the rest of the population because of low interest rate, low yield on corporate bonds and government bonds as well. So this is a real issue. The other measures, green was perhaps not a good choice because you may not be able to read that, but for the contribution level is to start earlier, if possible, to make it compulsory, pay it on all salary, and try and use just for retirement. Look at Malaysia, you can use for housing, Switzerland as well. This isn't such a good idea. And there's a lot you can do on the appropriate investment strategy and providing guarantees as well in the middle part. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, a number of notional defined contribution plans. This is something at ISSS, a number of our members have put these into place for not all of the benefit provision, but countries such as Poland and Sweden, part of the benefit provision is notional defined contribution, Italy as well. This can work, but it has to be handled very carefully. This is something personally I think needs to be handled and assessed very carefully, because there are a number of ways in which people get to retirement and don't have what they think they're going to have. And I was speaking to, and one of the reasons for this is a lot of change in rules and regulations and change in indexation and then the conversion rate and so on. Now, the reason behind this was to try and link benefits to the contributions paid, which is a fair objective, but it often has a number of side effects. And this quote in red was from one of our members, well, from someone we work with in the research, who said, I'm saving for retirement in Sweden, Swedish person, because I do not know what I will get from the Swedish pension system. And this is a pension expert. So these systems, we need to be very careful. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, what is an adequate pension system? Ultimately, it's a decision for each country based on the demographic, society view on solidarity, view on your approach to what is required to live in retirement. But I think there are a number of parts or ingredients that can strengthen it. So generally, most pension systems are multi-pillar system in one way or another. I think it's even at ISSS we can say there's a role for second and third pillar, because it provides elements that the first pillar social security doesn't necessarily do or can do. It's important there is a stability so people know what they're going to get. Stability and benefits provided, but also regulation. Defined benefit needs to be there for at least part of the benefit. Try and make it compulsory to avoid the free rider system by use incentives as well, because that encourages additional contributions, people working longer and moving people from informal to formal sector. Appropriate share of financing, and I put in red risk because we often underestimate how good people are at managing risk, particularly when it comes to investment choice. And a system that's perceived as both fair and simple, easy to understand. So thank you very much for your attention. Be pleased to take any questions, and I'll pass back.
Vamos a pasar en este momento a la parte de preguntas y respuestas. Se les ha pasado un papelito para que ustedes puedan formular su pregunta. Solo levanten el papelito y con todo gusto nuestras edecanes van a pasar donde ustedes a recogerlo para traerlo, para comenzar a responder a sus diferentes preguntas. Hay algunas preguntas ya que tengan a la mano, se levantan su papel y con todo gusto pasaremos donde ustedes a retirar el papel con la pregunta.
Well, the first question is what we should do increase wealth or increase social security's culture? ¿Se tradujo eso?
Yeah. I hope you give me the most difficult one first, because that's quite a fundamental question. Increase wealth is that the wealth in the wealth of a country before we can introduce social security? Right. I'll answer it as I understand it. I think there was a long idea that only rich countries could really afford a universal social security system. A number of ILO initiatives on 102, for example, on social security, was often perceived as some sort of unfair competition. But there have been a number of studies done, and actually the net cost of introducing social security is much lower than countries fear, or improving social security. And that's because a lot of the positive impacts of social security. So when I talked before about the leverage effects, improving the stability of population, supporting the wider family by providing adequate benefits, it's actually a very efficient investment of resources. So I don't think it's one before another. I think it's social security can enhance improving wealth, a country's wealth, but obviously there needs to be, an incremental approach to this, and the benefits should be increased gradually.
That's in Spanish. Acá alguien dice que en 1998 se privatizó el sistema de pensiones de Salvador, lo que ha generado una deuda previsional, perdón porque no entiendo bien la letra, que lleva décadas. A raíz de esta situación, las propuestas de la reforma son: 1, incrementar. ¿Quién la hizo esta? Un jeroglífico cretense. Se puede entender. Incrementar la edad de jubilación, hombres de 60 a 65 años, mujeres de 55 a 60 años. 2, disminuir la pensión, el monto de la misma, ya no sería del 70%, sino del 30%. Y 3, incrementar la cuota de cotización para los trabajadores. ¿Cuál es su opinión sobre estas propuestas?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I sympathize with the person, because I think the only time I write is to send postcards now. I spend all my time on the computer, so my handwriting is a lot worse than that. Yeah, this is, if I understood the question correctly, of the three possible options of changing retirement age, reducing pension amounts, or increasing contributions. I mean, there's no magic solution. To improving benefit levels requires increased contributions or a more favourable demographic situation, or increasing contributions. I think for the retirement age, there's a lot of debate, and I mentioned this in the case of Poland, that if the employment market allows to increase retirement age progressively, can make a lot of sense, but only if the measures to follow it are there. And I'll just give a couple of examples. In Germany, they spent a lot of money supporting elderly people in the workplace, and this can be with sort of very simple things like comfortable chairs and more flexible working hours. In Sweden, they increased the retirement age to 67, but actually companies were still letting people go at 65, which has been a bit of a problem. So it's not an automatic solution. Interesting as well, in Switzerland there's a debate, because in Switzerland it's one of the few countries where female retirement age is lower than men. And the aim is to increase it, and a lot of opposition comes from increased retirement age when you get rid of the other inequalities. We're happy being equal on retirement age, but not until we get rid of some of the other inequalities. So on its own, I think unilaterally that has to be phased in. It can't be just an overnight thing, but over the long term, I think life expectancy, we talked about this morning, has greatly increased. So to have retirement age at 55 or 60 is quite low. The other thing I'd say is try and have a system where people who work 30 years or 35 years on building sites in a very difficult working environment can still retire at an early age. And people like me, who sit on my backside most of the day working on the computer, can carry on a bit longer. For the contribution rates, sure, that's a possibility. There's obviously a level that will start to affect the cost of labour. So it's getting the right level. One of the things we measure, security of adequacy, is a fair share of contribution rates between employee, employer and the government. Reducing the pension amount is probably the last, I'd say, if that's the third option suggested here. Because again, if you're doing this too close to retirement, then people can't adjust, it's very difficult. And if you're doing it for younger people, then the situation is probably going to change in the future.
Well, the next one is in English too. In practice, how do you incentive people into contributions to social security when they see little or not valued pensions and have access to subsidized health care?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key question. This is one reason we produced our self-employed handbook and for migrant workers, and one of the key suggestions was to actually make it attractive, because one side you can try and impose this, but the reality is countries that have tried to do that, make it compulsory, have had very little success, or a lot of resources used to try and make it compulsory. So the main effort, I think, needs to be on trying to demonstrate what the value is. We have a good example from India, the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is a cooperative with a lot of very poorly paid female workers. They've created their own micro-social security system, contributory, I should add. And these women who earn very, very little money have a very high sign-up rate. And why? Because these are benefits provided they're appropriate for them. It's not the same as a standard social security. There are different benefits, although there are pension and work accident and so on. So that's been, it shows it is actually possible. The adequacy of benefits, I think, is very important, that people see that when they contribute, they'll get something of value out of it, so they don't just rely on social protection. And I think it's an educational thing as well. I think in the past we had, I think it was a pillar, one of the pillars I showed in the slide, they used to have in many countries an informal family support mechanism, which in many countries has disappeared. China is one of the most striking ones, with changing the demographics, but not the only one. A lot more migration, so people don't live near to their parents anymore. So the example, I think, from the Americas is increased social security education, incentivizing people to sign up. Government subsidies often help, of course, as well. So it's a mixture of measures. I don't think there's any magic solution. But where these measures have been made, where it's easy to sign up and people see the value of benefits, in Africa, a lot of countries, you can pay contributions through your mobile phone, so you don't have to go into the office, providing benefits that people actually want. In Tanzania, they asked people and they said, well, we don't sign up for social security because it's not the benefits we actually want. We want more sort of life insurance, a risk rather than pension. So a number of measures you can make. There's no magic solution, but I think that it can be quite positive when you look at the results of a number of our members.
There's no more questions? Well, thank you, Simon.
Great, thank you.
You told us very interesting things.
Thank you.
Nos vemos en la próxima.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Bueno.
Nuevamente queremos agradecer a Simon Brimblecombe por acompañarnos con esta importante ponencia, como también a George De Angelo por ese moderador tan importante en esta sesión. Antes de pasar a receso, quiero darles una información tan importante, donde se van a llevar a cabo las reuniones ordinarias, los horarios y los salones en los que se van a llevar a cabo. De las 5 a las 5:30, la reunión ordinaria de CAOSA en el Salón Palmeras. Reunión ordinaria CARS en Salón Conacaste. La reunión ordinaria de CAF en el Salón Los Girasoles. De 5:30 a 6 de la noche, la reunión ordinaria de CAF en el Salón Palmeras, la reunión ordinaria de CADAM en el Salón Conacastes y la reunión ordinaria de CAMS en el Salón Girasoles. De las 6 a las 7 de la noche, la subregión 1 Andina, Salón Los Conacastes. La subregión 2 Centroamérica, Salón Los Girasoles. La subregión 3 Cono Sur, Salón Real 1. La subregión Norteamérica y Caribe Anglo en el Salón Roble. La subregión México Caribe Latino en el Salón Jacarandas. De las 7 a las 8 de la noche, en la reunión de los miembros asociados para la elección de representantes ante el Comité Permanente de la Junta Directiva del CISS en el Salón Conacastes, y la reunión de los miembros adherentes y vinculados en el Salón Los Girasoles. Y con esto terminaríamos la jornada de este día. Por si tienen algunas dudas, nuestras edecanes estarán pendientes de poderlos guiar a los diferentes salones donde se van a llevar a cabo las reuniones ordinarias. Ustedes se pueden acercar a nuestras diferentes edecanes y ellas con todo gusto los van a llevar y los van a ubicar. Este sería parte de la información. Después del receso que se ha preparado especialmente para ustedes al salir del salón, iniciaríamos las reuniones. Muchas gracias.